So welcome back to Law and Crypto. My name is William Kraus. I'm an attorney focusing on litigation, governmental investigations, and other disputes related to digital assets and blockchain. So first of all, thanks for tuning in and good to see you all again. I was out for the last few weeks and I'm excited to be back. Needless to say, a lot has happened during the month of August. So I thought it'd be helpful to kind of cover a few of those items today and discuss as broadly speaking, their impact to crypto law and policy. So here's what I'm planning on covering. First, we're going to start with a discussion about the August 8th sanction of addresses associated with Tornado Cash. Then we're going to talk about some letters that were sent last week to various digital asset exchanges and federal agencies from a congressional committee and the macro policy push that I think they show for consumer and investor protection. Finally, we're going to talk a little bit about sort of pending legislation and what might happen between now and the November midterm for crypto policy. So before we do all that, as we start every show, this is my friendly reminder that while I am a lawyer, I am certainly not your lawyer. So anything I say is not to be construed as legal advice regarding your specific situation or investment advice of any sort. I also need to make clear that everything I say is my personal opinion and not necessarily the opinion of my law firm. My comments are being offered for discussion and entertainment purposes only. They also can be construed to be attorney advertising in some states. So you all know by now, you can find me if you want to talk to me about your personal issues or legal issues, rather. I'm on Twitter at WKRAUSESQ, or you can find my bio at my firm at butzel.com. So by now, you've probably heard a fair amount about Tornado Cash. And while it happened about a month ago, I think it's pretty important to discuss what happened because, really there are some pretty interesting policy implications. And let's briefly recap. On August 8th, 2022, the U.S. Department of Treasury's Office of Foreign Asset Control, or OFAC, announced that they had sanctioned the virtual currency mixer Tornado Cash, adding a number of their addresses or addresses associated with Tornado Cash to the SDN list, which stands for Specially Designated National List. Now, in short, the SDN identifies entities or accounts sanctioned by the U.S. government. And generally speaking, you don't want to be on that list. Inclusion in the SDN list means that all property or interests in property of Tornado Cash, as in the United States or in possession or control of U.S. persons, wherever they're located in the world, that's an important point, is blocked and must be reported to OFAC. It also means that all transactions by U.S. persons, again, wherever located, or within or transiting the United States that involve any property or interest in property of Tornado Cash are prohibited unless subject to some pretty narrow exemptions. These prohibitions specifically include any receipt of funds from or sending funds to Tornado Cash, regardless of the intent or the amount. It's another important thing. This is what's known as a strict liability statute, which basically means that a violation can occur even if it was unintentional or unknowing, and also if it is in a de minimis amount. So for example, even if you didn't know you were interacting with Tornado Cash and you sent just 1 penny worth of value, that is technically speaking a violation. So there are, of course, other implications for the SDN list that I'm not going to go over here. Again, this is not to be construed as legal advice, and certainly not a comprehensive summary of dealing with a sanctioned entity. I would advise that if you have any potential to interact with an SDN list member, if you will, or an address or somebody on that list, please do your due diligence because you don't want to get it wrong. So from a policy perspective, here's what I'm seeing. To start, I think it's worth noting that Tornado Cash was likely in OFAC's crosshairs for some time. First, given the nature of their business. I mean, we've seen for a very long time pronouncements of policy from the United States and from law enforcement, the DOJ, talking about sort of, the risk posed by, mixers. And while mixing currency isn't, itself inherently an illegal act, obviously it could be used to promote illicit activity, right? Money laundering, for example. So, this is actually the second mixer that's been sanctioned by OFAC. The first is Blender.io, which was sanctioned, I think, back in May 2022. And, OFAC noted in their press release for Tornado Cash that was used to launder more than $7 billion worth of virtual currency since its creation in 2019. Now, OFAC, as well as many other federal agencies, like I said, is extremely concerned about sort of national security implications, sort of the safety around, companies like Tornado Cash. And I think you're going to see a lot more of them sanctioned in the future. Also, the nature of Tornado Cash's business wasn't quite enough. I think the nail in the coffin here was likely their failure to impose controls designed to prevent its use for money laundering. Specifically, back in April, an address connected to the DPRK hack organization Lazarus that had been added to the SDN list in April went on to send something like 3,000 ETH to Tornado Cash, notwithstanding the fact it was on the SDN list. Now, given that Tornado Cash had exchanged funds for a sanctioned entity after they were sanctioned, clearly on notice, I think it was only a matter of time before we saw some sort of repercussions for Tornado Cash. And if you look at OFAC's sort of press release and discussion around Tornado Cash, it seems to say that they were maybe given an opportunity to speak to, safeguards or, steps that they may be able to take to remedy, their use as a money laundering sort of, like say, operation, but a tool for criminals. And I do very much get the sense that they sort of failed to assuage the concerns of the U.S. government. And we saw this sort of SDN list inclusion follow. Others have noted that we could see OFAC actually act much more aggressively because of the nature of Tornado Cash. And I think that's fair to say. And hopefully you've heard about this already, because I think it's important. Blender.io, looking back to the first mixture that was sanctioned by OFAC, I mean, that was effectively operating as a centralized exchange. So there you could actually had a person who was holding private keys, they're taking custody of assets. That person could, if they wish to, actually challenge being added to the SDN list, just like a bank or, whatever, any company or person who sanctioned could. Here, Tornado is very different, right? It's mainly decentralized. In fact, the 45 or so addresses are all ETH or USDC, what appear to be smart contracts that users just simply interact with. And here, some would argue that it's really code that's being sanctioned. And that's given rise to a number of sort of interesting arguments, right? Like if code is speech, as the Supreme Court has recognized, is this a prior restraint on free speech? I mean, really novel sort of legal arguments which are coming up after this has happened. So, for my audio visual component here, I will share the screen so you can actually see what this looks like. Bear with me. Here we go. All right, so you should see right now the SDN list update. So you could find this on Treasury's website, and it gives you the actual ETH and USDC addresses here that have been sanctioned. I mean, in response, USDC acted very quickly and froze or quarantined the funds that were found in these addresses, et cetera, et cetera. But it's interesting argument, right? Because where the service is provided by smart contracts, or it's highly decentralized, like I said, there's no one to really stand up and argue on behalf of Tornado Cash, at least not right off the bat. I mean, of course, there'll be affected people down the road who will have standing. But I think it sets a precedent for OFAC to sanction other highly decentralized services in DeFi or tokens. And I think that's a trend that we need to keep an eye on, right? Particularly given the rise of DeFi, the idea that sort of blockchain technology can act as a proxy for these more traditional organizations. It's like, okay, well, if you have a brick and mortar bank that is sanctioned, that's one thing. But again, when you have a whole sort of digital asset ecosystem built around decentralization, what do you do if sanctions start flying left and right? And like I said, various entities are sort of presenting or coming together with illegal challenges related to the sanction. Coin Center is a highly prominent nonprofit, advocating in the area of digital assets and blockchain to do some really good work. They've looked at the technical functioning of Tornado Cash as an example and say that it places it outside of sort of the statutory authority that's provided to OFAC. And we're gonna have to keep an eye on this and see what happens, because I think it's really going to have some repercussions for the bigger industry. At the same time, we're aware that there are some people who are, I'm going to say, behind Tornado Cash, but developers, things like that, who, could be implicated here. And in fact, there's been at least one arrest that we know about. Tornado Cash developer Alexei Pertsev, was arrested by Dutch authorities in Amsterdam a couple of weeks ago. And there was actually a claimed suspicion of involvement in concealing criminal financial flows and facilitating money laundering. That was a press release out of the Netherlands. And the press release further said that, since about June 2022, there's been a criminal investigation in Tornado Cash. And it really sort of suggests that their failure, again, to intervene sort of with the Lazarus situation probably put them on the radar of a lot of international law enforcement agencies. And that's a good point to make, right? Because the SDN list applies to U.S. persons. And how could it not? And Persev isn't a U.S. person. On the contrary, he's Russian. Here, you got to keep in mind that the U.S. isn't the end-all be-all when it comes to sanctions, right? There's other international law enforcement agencies out there, like in the Netherlands, who have their own money laundering statutes and their own sort of criminal statutes, who, like I said, might go around and round up people associated with these projects. So very, very interesting stuff. Again, it highlights the possibility of foreign criminal prosecution and cross-border governmental cooperation in response to dealing with these things. So, like I said, it's going to be interesting to see just how far this goes and whether it's reined in by subsequent court actions, which unfortunately could take some time. So we might be dealing with this as the sort of status quo for a while. All right, so let's move on. On August 30th, and I'll pull one up here, the House Committee on Oversight and Reform, associated with the Congress, requested information from 4 federal agencies: the U.S. Department of Treasury, Securities and Exchange Commission, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, and I think it was the FTC, or the Federal Trade Commission, as well as 5 digital asset exchanges. We have Kraken up here. There's also Binance US, Coinbase, FTX, and KuCoin, requesting information about the steps they're taking to combat cryptocurrency-related fraud and scams. Now, generally speaking, these letters requested for roughly a period covering about 13 years, extensive documentation, regarding policies that the government or these private entities had in place, as well as sort of narrative responses explaining what is being done to protect consumers. And I'll scroll into it. These all kind of look about the same. They basically say, this is the nature of the problem. There's $1 billion lost in 2022 to fraud. This is what cryptocurrency is, as if these agencies didn't know. Excuse me, and yada, yada, yada. And then sort of get to these requests, right? And, as a litigator, I can tell you, these are not necessarily light requests, right? I mean, this January 1st, 2009 time period, or the date Kraken was founded to the present, that's pretty broad. And I mean, what they're really looking for are sort of written policies and procedures, around what these entities have been doing. And they also sort of look for, more of these like interrogatory style narrative requests, right? Like, what tools, does Kraken currently have in place? What actions do you believe the federal government could take to assist in cryptocurrency exchanges and combating fraud and scams? So, and here's another example I'll show you. This is the one that went to the CFTC, which is, again, very interesting. Again, explaining what cryptocurrency is. The CFTC might not be necessary, but here, should cryptocurrency holdings be treated as commodities, securities, or both? Please explain. I mean, man, that's like a law. That's like a law school, 3-hour written exam right there. So it'll be interesting to see what the response is. It's kind of a wild question to ask, considering all the regulatory jockeying we've been seeing for years and very much recently in this space, with the SEC sort of, as we discussed in the last episode, regulating by enforcement and, a lot of hand wringing, the legislature kind of getting involved and introducing acts saying the CFTC can do this, the SEC does that, or vice versa. And we'll have to see what they say. September 12th is when these responses are all due. And, I'd love to see what the CFTC comes back with regarding which cryptocurrencies or why cryptocurrencies should be commodities, and what the SEC says in response to the same question about why they should have jurisdiction over securities. But, stepping back a little bit, I think it's interesting to talk about what's going on here. So, way back when I did my first episode, I think it was about the Biden EO. And, if you remember the executive order on crypto, it was really this sort of what I thought to be an optimistic policy pronouncement, talking in very broad strokes about these 6 key priorities that, the administration wanted to see in crypto, and, reached out to basically every federal agency that touched on crypto in any way. It didn't do studies, call for reports, recommendations, and actually make any new law. But, it sort of got the ball rolling and signaled very strongly that responsible innovation was what the US saw as its sort of role here in the crypto market, right? It wanted to be a leader. It wanted to bring in entrepreneurs and businesses, but it wanted to do it responsibly. So I'll do this as my final sort of slide. This is, if you might remember, the Biden EO 14067 was March 9th, ensuring responsible development of digital assets And here it talks about these principal policy objectives, these sort of key priorities. And number one, right here up front, is we must protect consumers, investors, and businesses in the United States. So we haven't really talked a lot about this, right? Because there's stable coins, there's all these other things that were making waves over the last couple of months that were very flashy. But at the end of the day, consumer protection is like super, super, super high priority for the US government here. And how could it not be? So, I'm looking at this, you have this committee in Congress with this extraordinarily broad jurisdiction, basically asking major public and private actors in the crypto space in the United States to explain what they're doing to protect investors. And I think that speaks to the Biden and the fact that the government really doesn't feel that nearly enough is being done to protect ordinary consumers and investors. And, I think there's a point there. We've spoken about this for, in the past, right? I mean, we talked about the UST debacle. We all know about Celsius and all these other sort of failures in the space of the last few months. And I mean, the pressure was already there to protect consumers and do more as, grandma and grandpa opened their Coinbase account and started investing in Bitcoin, and it just got turned right up to 11 with those things. So, you're going to see more of this stuff. You're going to see more pushing to promote consumer protection, investor protection. I mean, that is the double-edged sword of this sort of broad adoption that we've been wanting in crypto, right? You want to talk about crypto taking over the world and you use it to buy a cheeseburger and get your latte. Cool. But like, you have to have some controls in place if the government's going to stand by and sort of let this keep unfolding. And I don't think that means crush it. I mean, I've said this before, I don't think it means crush the industry. With overbearing regulation. That's not really conducive to the other aspect of this broad policy pronouncement. I mean, the US wants a seat at the table. They want to be the ones who set the regulation and the law, and they want to be the sort of financial hub for crypto, just like they are with traditional finance. You can't do that if you squash crypto. So, it's a fine line to walk, right? Like, how do we induce regulation that protects people, right? But at the same time, we keep the entrepreneurial, aspect of crypto. We keep the investment and we don't scare people off and make them run offshore. So, while I'm continuing to rant, I also know that there's a ton of scams out there. Whether or not it's an uptick recently, I can't say for sure, but it's interesting being, I joke, this humble country solicitor, and it's a deep cut from Downton Abbey, I think. But I'm sitting here in Michigan, and I probably have gotten a dozen calls over the last 3 months from victims of cryptocurrency scams. If I'm getting those in Michigan, right, and you just have to think about how many scams are out there and how much money is being lost. And having dealt with exchanges in response to those scams, there aren't really a number of exchanges out there that have great, remedies in place. You go and somebody, say they're contacted, they're 65 years old, somebody reaches out to them on LinkedIn, says, hey, either romantically or professionally, we should start talking. They build their trust up. They get them to send $50,000 to a US exchange. They then convert that to USDC and they export it to somebody's ERC20 address where they think they're seeing, a deposit to a different exchange. They think they're seeing real gains in the account. Turns out that that's fake. It's just sort of a manipulated, GUI or a graphical user interface that represents an exchange that doesn't exist. And when they go to take out their so-called profits, turns out there's always a delay and the money ultimately is shown to be gone. So that's called pig butchering scam. I've probably seen about 10 of those victims in the last couple of months. Extremely prevalent. And the exchanges, they have a couple things, it looks like you're trying to withdraw, you don't do that normally. But for someone who just wants to go open a quick account, verify it, take a ton of cash to an exchange and then convert it and withdraw it, there really isn't a great safety net there or sort of great controls. And maybe some would argue there shouldn't be. But on the other hand, people are legitimately losing their life savings, and ordinary consumers. And it's like, okay, maybe you shouldn't try to get rich quick, but professional scammers are targeting people and they're really getting hurt. So, again, if we want crypto to keep growing and we want it to keep being adopted, there's going to have to be some better sort of safety nets around this, or guardrails, if you will. So anyway, moving right along, we've seen a lot of these sort of cautionary pronouncements. Not too long ago, the Department of Labor came out with sort of this cautionary statement they offered. Fidelity was about to, I think, offer 401k holdings related to crypto, right? And you could go and hold, sort of Bitcoin equivalent or something like that. I forget the details, but DOL had gone and basically issued this letter, saying you guys are fiduciaries, you have ethical obligations, that's not conducive to, crypto holdings. You need to exercise extreme caution, and essentially saying we're going to come after you and look under, look in your books here if anything goes wrong, which, that's a shot across the bow from the retirement industry that very much wants to offer crypto to, retirees or retirement investors. So likewise, we saw the same thing with the Fed a couple of weeks ago. That sort of suggested or asked that any sort of bank or anybody in their supervision disclose anticipated or current crypto asset related activities. And they all kind of have the same ilk. Last week, actually, there was an introduction of a bill, Digital Commodities Consumer Protection Act of 2022, or last month, that also sort of leaned pro CFTC in terms of regulation of the market, but it would require crypto companies that dealt in digital commodities to register with the CFTC, like we see with traditional commodities exchanges, brokers, et cetera. And then they had to go and sort of establish consumer protection rules and guidelines around things like conflicts of interest, marketing, advertising, et cetera. Now, I'll take a break here. So all these things have the same message, right? Like, warnings from DOL regarding people investing with 401ks. You have warnings to banks where people hold their money. You have, basically people saying the CFTC should be in charge so they can put out, sort of protections around marketing and how crypto is pushed to people, and so on and so forth. All of this has the same message, right? And I think you're going to see more of this. You're going to see this push to make crypto look more like traditional finance. You want traditional finance, consumers, investors, people, coming like they do, to the banks with their savings and checking accounts. You're going to have to get some of these guardrails in place. So that's that. And then lastly, I wanted to speak a little bit about Congress. As we all know, we're heading towards these November elections. I'm not going to bury the lead here. I don't think much is going to happen between now and November, but I think it's interesting sort of to see where we're going. I mean, there's at least 20 bills right now in Congress that speak to crypto in some form, including two pretty broad policy pronouncements that sort of look at the whole market and try to make, very broad determinations as to this is a commodity, this is security, this is not. Things which would provide clarity that we really desperately need as lawyers and, as policymakers in this space. You have the Lummis-Gillibrand bill, which has been floating around for a while, and then you have that consumer protection bill I just referenced. It's another one. And, the idea that we need to sort out jurisdiction at CFTC, SEC, that we need to have some firmer, requirements and regulations around banks, around stablecoins, around consumer protection, as opposed to what's happening now, which is, like I said, the SEC and the CFTC kind of just duking it out in terms of complaints, injunctions, the courts trying to sort of, shoulder into what their jurisdiction is going to be very, very important. We've seen questions about self-regulation for the industry. Will we have something like FINRA, which, I don't know if you've ever heard of FINRA, but FINRA is really sort of a SRO or self-regulatory organization which polices the financial industry on its own. Interesting questions, and they're going to keep coming together. We have this sort of, crypto is now at the forefront being discussed in elections. People are taking policy positions, et cetera. Regardless of what happens in November, if there's a change in current composition of power, if it stays the same, this trend is going to continue. You are seeing the laws and the rules and the framework around crypto regulation, law, and policy being written in real time. So it's an exciting time to be in the space. As I've said before, I encourage you to engage, to pay attention, and be the voice you want to have heard as much as you can, if you feel strongly about these things. So that's what I got for you. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. We covered a lot, but like I said, it was kind of an interesting month for law and policy. And I look forward to speaking with you again soon. Thanks. Bye.